Have you ever wondered why chronic illnesses are on the rise despite all the advances in modern medicine? The answer might surprise you. So in this video, we'll uncover the hidden factors contributing to the surge in chronic illnesses, drawing on the groundbreaking work of physician and author Dr. Gabor Maté. So stick around to the end because we'll not only explore the root causes, but also some practical steps you can take to protect yourself and your loved ones. So now chronic illnesses like autoimmune disease, diabetes, even just mental disorders are becoming increasingly common. But what if I were to tell you that it may not be all about your individual lifestyle choices or your genetics? What if there's something more to this picture? So according to Dr. Gabor Maté, our environment plays a key role in shaping our health, both mental and physical. And we're not just talking about like physical environments. We're talking about the emotional and kind of social environment as well. So when you think about the constant stress, the fast-paced lifestyle, the pressure to perform, could these factors that are so ingrained in our culture actually be sabotaging our health? So that's what we'll discuss in this video. So again, a little bit of background. Dr. Gabor Maté, as you can see, it's a pretty big one. He wrote this book called The Myth of Normal: Trauma, Illness, and Healing in a Toxic Culture. And this title really gives away a lot of what we're going to talk about in this video. The myth of normal, that we have normalized a bunch of shit in our society that is fundamentally not normal. You know, the incredibly fast-paced lifestyle, the often loneliness, the overstimulation and addiction to technology, the hyper-processed foods, the chemicals, like all this stuff that's kind of just, we go about it and it's just day-to-day life in our country and our world is actually fundamentally pretty abnormal. And, further, he points out how it's kind of like if you have an animal or something or a plant that's not developing properly, a lot of times you have to look around, well, what's the quality of the soil? Is there any chemicals in the water? Does it have the proper diet? And often a toxic environment creates issues in development, diseases, disorders, maladaptations. And he makes the same case that in our culture, a toxic culture, is what's leading to a lot of our mental health issues, but also, as we're going to talk about in this video, chronic illnesses. And this is really not just him talking. This is grounded in something called the biopsychosocial model, which, as the name implies, means that we are kind of immersed in not only our biology, kind of genetics and the more tangible factors, but our psychology and our social environment. All of these things influence us and modulate us. And it's pretty incredible the extent to which this is true. So let me tell you about a study that is covered in this book. So they took rats and they essentially, and now a little bit unethical, I don't love this study, but I guess in the grand scheme of things, maybe the sacrifice was worth it. Anyway, they took rats and they basically intensely stressed them, almost like traumatized these male rats. And then they breeded them with healthy females, and they looked at the children of those rats. Okay, those children rats, whatever you call them, baby rats, were brought up in like a normal environment. And they tried to look at how those baby rats responded to stressors. And what they found is they had a lot of almost the equivalent of like mental disorders, that they had like dysregulated responses to stress, almost as though they had been exposed to trauma. But now remember, those baby rats were raised normally. The mothers were healthy. It was the fathers who experienced intense trauma. And this speaks to something called epigenetics, which is this kind of emerging field of research that suggests that our environments and our experience actually modulate the expression of certain genes. And so we're seeing that somehow, whether it was through an epigenetic factor or something, that these stressed male rats almost somehow passed along this trauma to their children. And then, you can make some connections to our current world with things like intergenerational trauma. And so this kind of speaks to the bigger picture here. And now think about maybe a more human example, a common chronic illness that might be diabetes. And so you may think about a child who their parents don't exhibit very healthy behaviors. And maybe their parents were abused growing up and had sort of a traumatic upbringing. And while they're not abusive to that child, they aren't super emotionally developed and they're not very nurturing of that child. And so that child feels sort of a little bit lost and a little bit uncared for. And so, as a coping mechanism for that lack of connection with emotionally available caregivers, that child says, well, when I eat this children's cereal that's marketed to me on the television every single freaking day, that's just sugar water, I feel good. I eat my Lucky Charms and I get a little pleasant. And so right there, you see the biopsychosocial model starting to sow the seeds for potential chronic illness of diabetes. How? Well, let's say there's some genetics involved and this child has a certain disposition for a certain health, physical health factors. That's fine. But psycho part of the biopsychosocial model, we just said their parents were not as nurturing as they could have been. And so this child needed to develop a coping mechanism to feel a little bit of that warmth or just positive emotion and satisfaction. And the child developed that behavior in the form of addictive sugary food, which, social part of the biopsychosocial model, were in our culture intentionally advertised to that child to addict them to that sugary, unhealthy food. So you can start to see, right, in that example, bigger picture here, how all of these factors coalescing around how this child who becomes a teenager and an adult develops diabetes. Because their tendency to be say something like, well, let's say, because we're talking type 2 diabetes here, not the kind you're born with. Oh, this person just isn't healthy and they made bad decisions. And that's fair. But again, we need to step back here, bigger picture, the psychological and social elements that drove that chronic illness. In this case, the child development theories, as well as culturally, why we advertise these addictive, chemically laced food to children. So this sets us up for his discussion. So what are some of the things that are driving this increase in chronic illness? And I actually found it interesting that he touched a little bit on chemicals and toxins and kind of like tangible sense, like toxic chemicals and whatnot, but that was not as much of the focus as much as, again, our psychological and social parts of that equation. And we talk about the stress epidemic, that we have kind of a very fast-paced culture that tends to value money, and there's relatively low financial safety net, assuming you don't come from kind of a middle or upper middle class or upper class background. And so this financial uncertainty, the fast-paced kind of vibe of the economy, all of these things lead to increases in stress. And you've probably heard this now that, there's kind of a stress epidemic. Well, it's been linked to a lot of physical health issues because it can dysregulate hormones and it can interrupt your metabolic function, which is, of course, all tied into your mental and physical health. Another challenge is the loneliness epidemic. We've seen an increasing kind of atomization. So break that down. Atom, right? Like a little particle. When I say atomization, it's like, taking someone or a unit that's pretty big and connected and, kind of condensing it down to the individual. In terms of our operating system, so to speak, we've become increasingly autonomous little entities cut off from the community. I mean, really think about it. Like 200 years ago, you had your tribe, right, of your entire kind of community around you, and maybe a small town or a small city. And it was like you go over to the butcher shop, and then you go over to the shoemaker, and then you go over to the schoolhouse, and you go over to church. And the sort of operating entity was a pretty big community. And then you see that kind of fading away to be more focused on the family, but the extended family and oftentimes immediate families, even if you go back 2 or 3 generations, had 5, 6, 7 people. I mean, I know my dad is one of 6 and my mom is one of 7. And so again, it's condensing a little bit into smaller family units, but still kind of a bigger social support system. But nowadays, it really feels like everything is structured around either the individual or the family unit, which in a lot of cases is 2 people. You've got one partner and maybe 1 or 2 kids, 2.2 kids. And so again, we see this kind of increasing way that society is structured towards less expansive or less broad support groups. And on top of that, this digital age, which has increased loneliness, and especially for men, this is true. We see that a vast majority of men report having only one or two kind of very close friends that they can trust in their lives. And so again, how does loneliness relate to chronic illnesses? That seems like a bit of a jump. Well, it's been shown that loneliness, or kind of the quality of your relationships or the lack thereof, has as many adverse health effects as being like a pack-a-day smoker or being obese. And this is something you can look at from the Grant study at Harvard University. And so if you're lonely, not only is your mental health going to suffer, but ultimately that translates into poorer physical health. And then finally, we have things that happen in our development. Oftentimes, it has to do with having less time for play and more time on phones. We have children that are not really developing properly. But even beyond that, there's a piece here of emotional development that I find fascinating. So Dr. Gabor Maté makes the case that repressed or suppressed emotions can ultimately lead to autoimmune disorders and other chronic illnesses. So I already gave the diabetes example, which is a little bit more straightforward, right? Where you see someone who doesn't quite have the nurture and love they need using sugary food as a coping mechanism, so they develop insulin resistance and ultimately type 2 diabetes. A little more subtle one might be someone who experienced an early childhood trauma. This is called ACE, so adverse child experiences, and people who are ACE, right, it's kind of a psychological category, have far higher incidences later in life of suicide, mental illness, addiction, and autoimmune disorders. And so he makes the case that oftentimes when you have a traumatic experience, you learn to suppress or repress or even kind of tune out from that emotion, because as a child, the emotion is so powerful and so big and so strong that you can't really fight back against it and you can't run away from it. So you kind of just freeze, you shut down, and you disconnect or you disassociate. And so he says what you develop there is a pattern of repression, which, think about what that word means, to press down or to kind of stuff down. And so he makes the case, looking at a lot of patients he's found, that as you build up a kind of tendency in your nervous system to repress, this can lead into issues where your body almost kind of attacks itself, or your immune system represses itself, and you get some of these autoimmune disorders, which he found are most common in, certain ones are most common in women, and they're found in women who have a personality type where they often repress or suppress themselves and their authentic anger or their authentic expression. And so he kind of makes this case, a little bit complicated, and you can check out the book summary, that as we repress or suppress our emotions, that can bleed into almost the suppression and repression in a physical dimension, leading to autoimmune disorders and chronic illnesses. And then, of course, you have the more direct example where you develop unhealthy behaviors as a coping mechanism for the psychological or emotional stressors, and those can also lead to chronic illnesses. So pretty interesting case here, again, that our kind of cultural norms, the fast-paced lifestyle, the stress epidemic, the loneliness, the increasing, maybe, dare I say, psychological satisfaction and authenticity and connectedness, all of those things, right? Biopsychosocial model, those psycho and social parts of that equation are undermining our health. And this manifests in mental health disorders, but also physical health disorders and chronic diseases. So what can we do? Couple things. First, if you are caring for children, you're raising children, or maybe you have nieces and nephews, one thing to consider is encouraging them to be authentic in their self-expression of emotion. So this does not mean that if they freak out and throw a tantrum, you're like, hey, great job. But he points out an issue that we often make in parenting, and I'm not a parent, so I'm paraphrasing Dr. Gabor Maté, where a child is upset or they're angry, and we kind of say, all right, well, until you're not angry, you're going to go sit alone in timeout. Now, think deeply about what's happening there. this child is wanting to authentically express their emotion or frustration. And we're basically saying, hey, you have two options. You can be authentic and stay true to yourself and express how you feel, or you can be part of our group and you can get love, but you can't have both. Now you start to see how that repression of your authentic emotions and your authentic feelings can start to become wired as a pattern in your development. Because as a child, I start to say, oh, well, if I let people know how I really feel and I really feel what emotions I'm feeling and express myself authentically, I'm going to get shunned. I'm going to get kicked out of the group. So there's a subtle middle ground here, right? Of you can coach them through it. And of course, certain behaviors, if they throw a tantrum and hit someone or something, right, we need to address that. But generally speaking, as a parent, we are responsible for helping the child to regulate their own emotions. So how we process and regulate our own emotions, the child mirrors that and picks up on it. And so we want to regulate our own emotional states in healthy ways where we can authentically feel and express emotions but not lose control of them. And then invite that child into an experience where we have not made love and connection conditional on presenting a certain way. Rather, we can say, hey, I'm going to love you no matter what, or you're in part of the group and you're included. And yet there are certain ways that we have to control ourselves and express ourselves. So subtle, but important. And the next one is leaning into your community, whatever that is, your colleagues at work, people in your neighborhood, your social circle, your extended family. Anything you can do to try and expand that feeling of connectedness. We are social creatures. We grew up, evolutionarily speaking, in tribes, and so that's an essential part of life. And then the final thing is consider trying therapy, and you can even try therapy comes on yourself. And the way that you do that is just do an inventory of past experiences you've had that maybe could be leading you to repress or suppress certain emotions, or think of it certain negative experiences you've gone through. And what would it mean to give yourself permission to feel those negative emotions? And what we tend to find is that if you can identify the origin of those unhelpful patterns or negative emotions, give yourself permission to experience them and investigate where that tendency or where that kind of energy came from, oftentimes it will kind of dissipate and it will allow you to connect more deeply with your authentic self. And even a specific protocol you can try is something called the Pennebaker protocol. Now, this is a well-researched protocol that involves basically journaling about a really, really terrible and maybe even traumatic experience in your life. And there's a certain process, so I recommend you Google it. Dr. Andrew Huberman from Stanford University has a good video or podcast on it. But you go through this process several times, and it helps you almost process what may have been a potentially traumatic experience that could be, in subtle ways, undermining your mental health and physical health still today. So as we wrap up this video, when we think about where chronic illnesses are coming from today, a lot of it seems to have to do with the psychological and social pieces of the biopsychosocial model. And that the oftentimes feelings of uncertainty, of stress, of disconnectedness, and even just overwhelm when we look at the massive problems facing our world of wars and climate change and political dysfunction, this kind of toxic psychological and social energy can show up in physical ways, impacting our health through disease and illness, and of course mental health as well. And so a couple prescriptions to work through that, right, relate to how we help our children to develop is making sure we don't, by accident, right, we never do this intentionally, by accident make them choose between attachment or authentic self-expression, making sure at the same time we are capable of authentic self-expression by processing those difficult or negative or painful emotions and experiences, potentially with the Pennebaker protocol. And then finally, doing everything we can to be intentional in creating a broader social circle and community. That could be through work, it could be through religious community, your local community, interest groups, extended family. All that is going to buffer our physical and mental health to help us be happier and experience greater well-being. So That was a pretty detailed analysis. I have one of my more popular videos as well. You can check out on my channel is the chapter by chapter summary of this book by Dr. Gabor Maté. And on this channel, I really just do my best to articulate the art and the science of happiness studies to give you some both interesting insights, but also practical tools to be happier in your daily life. So here's a video that YouTube suggests you'll like, and that's all for now. This has been the Happiness PhD Project with Jackson Kirchis. Thank you for watching.